One sentence from a 9-year-old changed the entire royal narrative, and it wasn't even meant for the public. In the hallowed corridors of Britain's most powerful family, where protocol whispers louder than rebellion, no one imagined that the fiercest voice would come from a child not even tall enough to reach the drawing room doorknob. But that's exactly what happened when Princess Charlotte, the poised yet spirited daughter of Prince William and Princess Catherine, uttered a single sentence that stopped Queen Camilla in her tracks and sent shockwaves through the monarchy. "I don't need your school to be a real princess." 7 words. Simple, clear, but seismic in their impact. Behind this moment of defiance lies a simmering power struggle, one that had been quietly unfolding for months. It wasn't just about a school, it was a proxy war over values, identity, and the future of the crown. While the world assumed the summer of 2025 would be a peaceful retreat for the Wales family, quietly tucked away at Anmer Hall, Queen Camilla had other plans. Far from a restful royal vacation, it became the battleground for an ideological war. And Charlotte? She became the unlikely general. Camilla's intentions were shrouded in the formalities of palace language, but insiders knew what she was really doing. She was leveraging her influence over King Charles, subtly pressing for Princess Charlotte to join her brother George at a prestigious boarding school in Berkshire St. Thomas's Preparatory. On the surface, it was tradition. Behind the scenes, it was control. For Camilla, boarding school was not just a rite of passage, it was a crucible. She believed it built the kind of resilience a royal needed to survive the modern world. But William and Catherine had drawn a line. They chose Lambrook specifically because it allowed their children to come home each night. To them, bedtime stories, shared dinners, and everyday routines weren't just luxuries, they were necessities. Then came July. A time when the royal machinery usually slows down, when the tabloid frenzy takes a breath. But in the quiet fields of Norfolk, tension began to hum beneath the surface. On July 19th, Queen Camilla arrived at Sandringham, and palace watchers immediately took note. The court circular listed it simply as a family luncheon, but palace insiders confirmed she had 2 very specific objectives: to update the king on Clarence House renovations, and to resurrect the boarding school discussion, a conversation already rejected, twice, by the Waleses. Staff members reported an unease in the air from the moment Camilla's car rolled down the gravel drive. The estate, usually humming with the sound of royal children at play, felt tense. Security seemed tighter, conversations more hushed. A senior equerry reportedly briefed a trusted journalist under anonymity, hinting that the Queen's visit wasn't just casual, it was strategic. The monarchy's internal compass was being tested. The moment hadn't arrived yet, but the pieces were moving. Catherine was seen walking barefoot with the children along Holcombe Beach the day before. William made an early morning run to Norfolk country stores. On the surface, it was all smiles and simplicity. But within palace walls, behind the hedges and the hedgerows, murmurs grew louder. Camilla wasn't just visiting family. She was coming to enforce a decision, to reshape the narrative. And this time, she believed, she would win. But no one expected a child's voice to be the one that would echo through centuries of royal tradition. Grainy photos, whispered reports, and a royal kitchen garden, something big was boiling under the surface. For weeks, the outside world believed the royal summer was unfolding just as planned. Anmer Hall, the countryside sanctuary for the Prince and Princess of Wales, had slipped into its annual rhythm of rest and retreat. There were glimpses, of course, Prince William behind the wheel of an SUV heading toward the Norfolk country stores, Catherine trailing barefoot along Holcombe Beach with the children. Reporters stationed miles away tried capturing long-lens photos, but the real story was always out of frame. Because inside the estate, hidden behind age-old hedges and guarded gates, silence wasn't peace. It was pressure building. The Waleses had designed this summer meticulously. After the chaos of spring, King Charles's ongoing cancer treatments, relentless Commonwealth obligations, and growing public scrutiny, they craved normalcy. They wanted 2 things the royal calendar rarely allowed: distance and stillness. For a while, they almost had it. 2 weeks of uninterrupted quiet. No press. No protocols. Just the hum of a simpler life. But peace in the palace is rarely sustainable. The first ripple came not from the tabloids, but from within. Rumors began circulating that Queen Camilla was planning something more than just a visit. No fanfare, no public announcement, just a quiet arrival at Sandringham on July 19th. Officially, it was for a family luncheon. But royal insiders knew that court circulars are often used to disguise more delicate intentions. And this visit had weight behind it. According to a senior equerry who later briefed a royal correspondent under anonymity, Camilla was there for two reasons: to deliver updates on Clarence house renovations and, more provocatively, to reopen the conversation about Charlotte's future. This wasn't a new discussion. Months prior, Camilla had privately expressed her disapproval of William and Catherine's decision to enroll Charlotte in Lambrook, a day school. To her, it was a sentimental detour from royal tradition. Camilla believed that boarding school forged character discipline, resilience, self-reliance. She'd lived that truth, or so she claimed, and credited her survival during the tabloid-stained 1990s to lessons learned inside dormitory walls. But for William and Catherine, the notion of sending their daughter away, especially at such a formative age, was unthinkable. Still, Camilla wasn't backing down. She'd waited until summer, believing that the relaxed setting might soften resistance. But what she didn't anticipate was the deep resolve behind the Wales family's apparent calm. Because while their public image was one of barefoot beach walks and bedtime stories, behind closed doors, they were defending a philosophy. Insider sources later confirmed that tensions had started days before the fateful lunch. Courtiers reported unusually frequent internal calls between Sandringham and Clarence House. Security presence increased subtly. Even longtime staffers noticed the difference. There were whispered exchanges in corridors, cryptic glances during routine briefings, and a sense that something pivotal was approaching. The tabloid silence only added to the unease. Typically, the summer recess meant small royal stories, baby photos, charity updates, and garden parties. But now, there was an eerie pause, as if the press sensed something was about to break. And it was. Because on that day, as the royal lunch began to unfold, the confrontation everyone feared was coming closer. Camilla was no longer just a royal consort with opinions, she had become a catalyst. A woman carrying the weight of tradition, pressing against the evolving values of a younger generation. The kitchen garden, usually a quiet refuge for tea and hydrangeas, was about to become a battleground. And then, on a day meant for peace, the unthinkable happened in the kitchen garden. She stepped out from behind the apple tree, and history shifted on its axis. It wasn't supposed to be a scene of confrontation. The air was still, the setting casual linen pants, garden chairs, and a faint breeze brushing through the hedges. But beneath that carefully composed calm, centuries of expectation and silent power plays collided in one of the most unfiltered exchanges the royal family has seen in decades. Queen Camilla, steady in tone but sharp in intent, had just uttered the sentence that would become a spark: "A proper royal finds backbone at boarding school." It was a statement framed as tradition, but laced with control, a quiet demand for conformity masquerading as advice. And it was directed squarely at a little girl whose silence, up to that point, had been mistaken for submission. Catherine, always poised but visibly guarded, stood near the garden chairs, her hands tightly clasped. William had just returned from the house, Charlotte's son hat in hand, unaware that he was about to witness the moment his daughter would shatter the illusion of calm. Up until that instant, Charlotte had been hidden tucked behind a tree, perhaps curious, perhaps listening longer than anyone realized. But when she heard Camilla's words, something shifted. Witnesses say she stepped forward without hesitation. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Because what she said sliced through generations of royal dogma in a single unwavering line: "I don't need your school to be a real princess." It wasn't just what she said, it was when, how, and to whom. This wasn't a petulant retort from a child tired of lectures. It was a declaration. A refusal to be molded into a version of royalty defined by detachment, boarding houses, and institutional distance. And coming from the granddaughter of Princess Diana, the woman who shook the palace by choosing heart over hierarchy, it was a message thick with symbolism. In that garden, surrounded by rose bushes and tradition, Charlotte didn't just speak. She redefined the boundaries of who gets to dictate what makes a royal. Two gardeners would later recall the hush that followed. A discreet staff member described it as a silence, so sudden it felt physical. William reportedly placed a comforting hand on Charlotte's shoulder, but his face, according to one observer, carried both shock and pride. Camilla, taken aback, said nothing. Her breath caught, her eyes flickered, and without a word, she turned and walked toward the waiting convoy. Moments later, the crunching of gravel under tires marked her retreat, not just from Sandringham, but from a conversation she thought she controlled. The staff who witnessed the scene didn't rush to speak. They knew what they'd seen wasn't ordinary. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was clarity uttered with the simplicity only a child could summon, and yet it hit like thunder. Charlotte's words weren't polished or rehearsed, but they struck a nerve the crown had long ignored. Because for centuries, titles were earned through sacrifice, silence, and subservience to the institution. But now, standing in that sun-dappled garden, the crown was being challenged not by scandal, not by politics, but by a young girl's quiet insistence on agency. The symbolism was too powerful to ignore. Charlotte, whose middle names are Elizabeth and Diana, carries the weight of two legacies, one of unshakable authority, and the other of emotional revolution. In that moment, she embodied both. She wasn't just resisting a school, she was pushing back against an outdated idea of royalty. Against the notion that strength is found only in separation, and that vulnerability has no place behind palace walls. Her words weren't just about herself. They spoke to a broader question. What does it mean to be a modern royal in a world that increasingly demands authenticity over stoicism? Witnesses say the atmosphere remained tense even after Camilla departed. But something fundamental had changed. A single voice, once considered too young to matter, had taken control of the room and, unbeknownst to her, ignited a conversation that would soon rage across the entire country. Charlotte didn't just respond to Camilla. She responded to an institution. And she did it not with anger or rebellion, but with poise and conviction that many adults still struggle to find. That single sentence traveled faster than any royal decree straight into the heart of a nation. By sunrise, the headlines had exploded. By noon, the world had chosen a side. The royal family awoke to a media storm they never saw coming. Just after 8:40 a.m., a tweet from the royal editor of the Daily Courier lit the fuse. Tiny voice. Ground shook massively. No names. No confirmation. But it didn't matter. Within minutes, royal watchers and digital sleuths began connecting the dots. And by the time the full story began to surface, Charlotte's words, the confrontation with Camilla, the eerie silence that followed the public had already crowned her a heroine. The moment was no longer confined to a quiet royal garden. It had detonated across headlines, timelines, and airwaves around the world. It didn't take long for the hashtags to take over. Hashtag Charlotte says no, and hashtag boardinggate became global trends before mid-morning tea. Memes flooded social media platforms with breathtaking speed. One showed Charlotte in medieval armor, defying a dragon-crowned Camilla. Another replaced Buckingham Palace with the phrase Princess Charlotte's Kingdom. Overnight, she had become a symbol of resistance, of innocence, of modern royalty unwilling to be molded. She didn't just reject a school. She rejected an entire ideology. And that, for a public long disenchanted with the monarchy's rigidity, was a revolution. The tabloids responded first, and loudest. The Sun screamed with the headline Little Miss No, while the Mirror called her the future Queen of Hearts. Even broadsheets, normally cautious in their royal coverage, couldn't resist. The Times led with, 9-year-old princess breaks royal mold. The frenzy spilled into talk shows and morning radio, where panelists debated the merits of day school versus boarding, while commentators dissected every aspect of Charlotte's upbringing. But beneath the noise was something deeper. The conversation had moved from logistics to meaning. Why did this moment matter so much? Why did it strike such a nerve? Because this wasn't just a headline. It was a cultural reckoning. Clarence House, caught completely off guard, scrambled to contain the fallout. Initially, they dismissed the reports as creative fiction, hoping silence would suffocate the flames. But the opposite happened. The silence roared. Kensington Palace, meanwhile, chose to stay quiet. No confirmations, no denials. Just a single carefully worded line leaked through aides. The family is focused on the well-being of their children. But that vagueness only fueled the storm. The public filled in the blanks. And in doing so, they crowned Charlotte with something far more powerful than a title: authenticity. Suddenly, this wasn't about a school enrollment. It was about trust. About a little girl refusing to be pushed, and a royal family forced to face the changing tides. By midday, radio phone-ins were overwhelmed. Parents, teachers, and even former royals chimed in. A former palace aide admitted anonymously that the incident had sparked more emotional conversation inside the palace than anything since Diana's infamous interviews. Royal biographers began rewriting narratives in real time. Even Buckingham's press office reportedly requested a briefing on the Charlotte situation. And still, Charlotte herself was nowhere to be seen. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her words echoed because they stood alone, untouched by spin. They were pure. And purity, in a world jaded by scandal and spectacle, was magnetic. She had captured the imagination of millions not as a princess by blood, but as a voice of clarity in a royal house clouded by old ghosts and outdated rules. But this wasn't just about a school, it was about a legacy, a parenting philosophy, and a generational reckoning. One believes in tradition. The other believes in timing. And caught in the middle is Charlotte. Behind the closed doors of Britain's most storied family, what looks like a simple disagreement over schooling is, in truth, a defining battle over how the next generation of royals will be shaped. On one side stands Queen Camilla, a survivor of tabloid wars, molded by rigid routine and hard-won endurance. To her, character is not nurtured in comfort, but forged in solitude. On the other side stands Prince William, future king, determined to break the mold his family once forced around him. He sees a different path for his children, one paved with presence, empathy, and emotional security. This isn't a policy dispute. It's a clash of royal ideologies. And Charlotte, unintentionally or not, has become the symbol of its resolution. Camilla's approach isn't cruel, it's inherited. She attended Queen's Gate boarding school in her youth, and while she never spoke of it fondly, she often credited it for the grit that helped her survive the cruel tabloid onslaught during her early relationship with Charles. According to her friends, she believes that a boarding school strips away entitlement and replaces it with resilience. It was, to her mind, the only reason she withstood the storm of public hatred when she entered royal life. So in her view, Charlotte should follow suit not out of malice, but necessity. To Camilla, it was preparing her for a world that will scrutinize every blink, every misstep. But William and Catherine don't share that vision. They've drawn a sharp boundary between their family and the royal machine that once devoured childhoods and spat out silent figureheads. At Lambrook, Charlotte can return home each evening. She's tucked into bed by her mother, not by a dorm matron. Her weekends aren't filled with house points and disciplinary structure, but pancakes and bike rides. They aren't raising heirs. They're raising children who one day will inherit not just a crown, but a world radically different from the one Camilla grew up in. To William, this isn't theoretical. It's personal. He remembers the voids left by royal traditions. He remembers being told, not asked. And he remembers his mother, Diana, who fought those same expectations until it cost her everything. Sources close to the family say that when Camilla pressed the issue behind closed doors, William didn't mince words. "My daughter will board over my dead body," he reportedly said, in eruption not of anger, but of principle. Because for William, this isn't just about Charlotte. It's about righting the wrongs of a past that still lingers like smoke in every palace room. Catherine stands firmly at his side. Her interviews have long reflected a maternal philosophy rooted in empathy, routine, and emotional literacy. She's spoken of widening empathy, and giving children the tools to understand themselves before they're expected to represent anyone else. It's a sharp deviation from the stiff upper lip doctrine that dominated royal child-rearing for generations. And now, with Charlotte standing her ground in that garden, it was clear this philosophy wasn't just theory, it was working. But the philosophical clash isn't just between old and new. It's between two versions of strength. Camilla's is armored, trained in detachment and routine. William's is adaptive, rooted in love and agency. Both believe they are protecting Charlotte. But only one of them is listening to her. And as the palace tried to mask the divide with diplomacy and silence, the world had already taken a side. They weren't just witnessing a family disagreement. They were watching a generational fork in the road, one that could reshape how the monarchy relates to its future and its people. But this wasn't just a parental disagreement, it was a clash between the past and the future of monarchy. She never met her grandmother, but Diana's presence guided everything. Though time and tragedy denied Charlotte the chance to hear her grandmother's voice or feel her embrace, Diana's influence lingered in ways more powerful than memory. It lived in how Charlotte walked through conflict, in how she spoke her mind with gentle defiance, and in how she saw the world not as a series of rules to obey, but as a place to shape with kindness and courage. And while her name Charlotte Elizabeth Diana had always paid homage, it was only now, in the aftermath of a single sentence, that the legacy truly revealed itself. Because Diana was never just a princess. She was a disruptor. A nurturing rebel who chose empathy over elegance, who held AIDS patients' hands when others wore gloves, who cried openly on international stages, and who chose her sons over the rigid obligations of royal formality. Her life was one long war against emotional suppression. And she fought to give William and Harry a piece of a real-world, a world where feelings weren't buried for optics, where a royal child could still be a child. William never forgot that. He lived through her rebellion, survived her heartbreak, and was shattered by her death. And now, as a father, he's carried her torch into his own home, determined that Charlotte wouldn't just inherit a title, she'd inherit the right to feel, to speak, and to choose. Insiders say William keeps framed photos of Diana in his private study, not for show, but as a compass. Catherine, too, is said to reference Granny Diana during bedtime moments with the children, especially when teaching them about empathy, kindness, and standing up for others. It's subtle, often unspoken, but unmistakable. Diana's spirit has become the invisible thread woven through the very fabric of Charlotte's upbringing. So when Charlotte said no, it wasn't just her own voice rising in that garden, it was the echo of a woman who once stood in front of cameras and refused to play by the palace script. The connection between Diana's rejection of Gordonstown and Charlotte's defiance over boarding school cannot be ignored. Diana, famously, chose Eton for William, a break from the royal mold that stunned the establishment. She had suffered deeply in environments that prioritized discipline over warmth, and she refused to allow her son to do the same. William remembers. And now, decades later, he's honoring that memory not through tribute but through action. Charlotte's education, her emotional safety, her boundaries, these are not luxuries in his eyes. They are sacred. And yet, it's more than personal. Royal historians point to this moment as a clear mark of evolution. Where once royal strength meant silence and endurance, it now embraces authenticity and emotional truth. Where once Diana's rebellion was seen as dangerous, it is now the model guiding the next generation. Charlotte's boldness, wrapped in innocence, has become the embodiment of everything her grandmother stood for, proof that change can skip a generation and still land exactly where it was always meant to. And as the world debated her voice, Charlotte's family quietly regrouped to protect her soul. The palace scrambled to contain the fallout, but every silence screamed louder than words. What followed Charlotte's statement was not just a media frenzy, it was a crisis. And inside Clarence's house, the mood shifted from confusion to control. As the headlines grew bolder and the public support surged toward Charlotte like a tidal wave, palace officials called an emergency meeting behind tightly closed doors. Only a few were invited. The most senior courtiers. Crisis communication advisors. One former official would later leak the minutes, revealing that what unfolded wasn't a plan, but a panic. 3 strategies were laid out. The first? Double down on tradition. Defend boarding school as a royal standard. Remind the public that generations of monarchs, George VI, Charles, even William, had boarded. Spin Charlotte's comment as a moment of youthful misunderstanding. Hope the noise fades with time. But even the most seasoned advisors saw the flaw. The public had already chosen their narrative, and it wasn't one the Crown had written. The second option was riskier, but real. Shift the story. Acknowledge the generational divide. Frame Camilla not as an antagonist, but as a concerned elder. Show humility. Let Charlotte's defiance be seen not as rebellion, but strength. Camilla, reluctantly, agreed. But her discomfort ran deep. "I'm blamed for caring," she reportedly said to a close aide. As if wanting the best for her is some sort of crime. Another insider claimed she felt stabbed by childish gossip, wounded not by the child's words, but by the public's ruthless reaction. The third strategy? Say nothing. Let the media consume itself. Maintain the palace's centuries-old strength, stoic silence. But that silence was no longer golden. It was deafening. The longer they waited, the more the nation turned Charlotte into a symbol and Camilla into a villain. Even Camilla's loyalists began to worry. The wicked stepmother trope had re-emerged, and no amount of charity work or school visits could stop the whispers. In the end, a middle path was chosen. A statement, brief, polite, and surgically worded, was issued from Clarence's house. It praised Lamrouk's outstanding pastoral care, and affirmed that Charlotte would remain enrolled for the upcoming term. No names. No confrontation. But the implication was clear, the decision was made, and it wasn't Camilla's to make. Yet inside the palace, fractures widened. Some courtiers quietly applauded Charlotte's poise. Others, more traditional, saw the moment as dangerous, a child appending centuries of structure with a single phrase. William, meanwhile, remained silent in public, but privately made it clear, his daughter's voice would not be buried beneath protocol. Camilla resumed her duties, her smile more restrained, her eyes a little more distant. Friends say she felt misunderstood, unfairly painted, and emotionally bruised by the storm. But she wasn't the only one left shaken. The entire institution had been tested, and not by a scandal, not by a political misstep, but by the voice of a child refusing to be silenced. And while the palace spun words, Charlotte returned to something much more powerful: her everyday life. She returned to school with her head high and her curiosity sharper than ever. While the palace continued its quiet scramble to manage perception, Charlotte stepped back into her everyday life with a kind of grace no publicist could manufacture. There were no further statements from her, no second headlines. Just a return to the rhythms that grounded her: brownies, netball practice, pages of Matilda devoured in a single evening, and the calm reassurance of a classroom that felt more like a home than a proving ground. At Lambrook, she blended back into her cohort, but those paying attention could see a quiet change in her stride. The girl who had calmly declared her refusal to be molded into someone else's idea of a royal hadn't just returned, she had evolved. One teacher at the school later recalled a moment that seemed small but carried weight. During a lesson on history and monarchy, Charlotte raised her hand and asked, "Are all queens nice?" It wasn't a challenge, it was genuine curiosity. But in that one question lay the echo of all that had passed. She wasn't afraid to ask difficult things. She was trying to make sense of the world around her, not through deference, but understanding. It was a question born of wisdom, not rebellion, and it left a quiet hush in the room. The teacher, touched by the moment, answered gently, "Queens, like all people, can be many things." Charlotte nodded, then went back to her coloring. But the moment stayed with everyone who witnessed it. Inside Kensington Palace, the parenting strategy subtly shifted. With public scrutiny reaching a new peak, William and Catherine made a choice. Privacy became paramount. Devices were quietly removed from common areas. Newspapers were rolled up and stored away. Family time intensified. Bedtime stories doubled, and Charlotte's questions about everything from courage to consequence were met with unflinching honesty. William, reportedly shaken by how quickly the media storm had enveloped his daughter, focused not on shielding her, but on strengthening her sense of self. Because in a world where even a child's truth could become clickbait, the only way to protect her was to help her own her voice. That meant time, real, undistracted time. And so, father and daughter took to the forests. On bike rides through the Sandringham woods, they talked not about press statements or headlines, but about feelings. Witnesses claimed they saw Charlotte riding alongside William, her hair blowing wildly, her laugh echoing under the canopy of ancient trees. On one such ride, a passerby overheard a snippet of conversation. Charlotte asked, "Did I cause trouble?" William's answer remains private, but her smile unburdened. Free suggested he told her exactly what she needed to hear. Dr. Morgan Reeves, a family counselor with decades of experience working alongside the aristocracy, later weighed in. When a child asserts agency publicly, the parent's job is not to stifle it, but to honor it in private, he said. That's how trust is built. That's how character is formed. By affirming Charlotte rather than correcting her, William and Catherine weren't raising a rebellious royal, they were nurturing a confident young woman who understood the power of her own voice. But for the House of Windsor, Charlotte's stand became more than personal, it reshaped the monarchy's image. In the end, one sentence from a child became a lesson for the throne itself. For centuries, nobility was measured by bloodline, ceremony, and silence. But with one quiet act of resistance, Princess Charlotte shattered the illusion that royalty must conform to survive. Her words didn't merely ripple through the royal household, they detonated at its very core. And now, with the dust settling, voices far beyond the palace walls have begun to weigh in. Historians, commentators, and cultural analysts aren't treating Charlotte's defiance as a cute anecdote or fleeting moment, they're calling it a generational shift. A pivotal point in the monarchy's evolution where duty was redefined by the honesty of a child rather than the expectations of a crown. Dr. Penelope Hart, a royal historian and author of The Heirs of Empathy, called Charlotte's declaration a paradigm reset. Not since Diana has the monarchy been forced to acknowledge the raw power of emotional intelligence over regal composure. Hart, like many others, sees Charlotte as the first royal of her generation raised to embrace authenticity as a strength, not a liability. Public figures echoed this sentiment. Parliament members, school psychologists, celebrity parents each chimed in, applauding Charlotte for her bravery and praising William and Catherine for choosing presence over protocol. The long-term implications are impossible to ignore. Should Prince George ascend the throne, Charlotte's role as Princess Royal would place her squarely in the public eye for decades. Her conduct, her causes, her voice, they would shape public perception of the crown just as Diana's compassion once did. But this time, the change wouldn't come in spite of the palace, it would come from within it. A young girl had proven that you don't need to scream to be heard, and you don't need a crown to command respect. You only need the courage to stand firm when the world expects you to bend. And even Camilla, despite the early resistance and emotional fallout, began to evolve. In the months that followed the incident, her public engagements subtly shifted. She leaned more into empathy-based causes, read Charlotte's Web at a primary school, and appeared more open in interviews. Some say it was PR. Others, including those closest to her, believe the lesson truly sank in. She saw what the world saw, that Charlotte's honesty wasn't defiance. It was dignity. It was grace on her own terms. Slowly, Camilla's image softened. Not because she won the argument, but because she learned from it. Polling data from Ipsos Mori conducted just days after the incident revealed a staggering public consensus. 82% believed Charlotte's decision to speak up was justified. Among parents, that support jumped to 91%. But perhaps most revealing was the final question on the poll: what defines a royal today? For the first time, the majority answer wasn't duty or tradition. It was authenticity. So the lesson was clear. In an age of polished statements and orchestrated appearances, the most powerful thing a royal can do is be real. Not perform. Not obey. But live truthfully. Charlotte didn't just stand up for herself, she set the bar for what it means to carry a title in the modern world. And so, as autumn arrives at the palace gates, a young girl stands taller not in heels, but in courage. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.